I love about our conversations are the energy and how fun they are. So I want the
Me too.
whole I want the whole thing to be part of this.
Yeah, totally cool.
Um, so welcome to episode 7 of Conversations on Healthcare. And today I am thrilled to have a colleague, Angie Gallagher from BurstIQ. She is for me at least, I think of you as the blockchain queen. And
Oh,
now you're like the queen of video. So it's really great to see you. Thank you for doing this. Oh, how are you?
things are really well. It's we're all basically trying to figure out when COVID is going to end and what is it going to take for it to end. At this point, it's is it the waiting game? But to me, the waiting game isn't really enough.
I actually think that people are going to have to rethink how they're thinking about it because I don't see this as ending per se. I think that we live in a new normal, right? You posted, a podcast, a link to a podcast recently, and we have to figure out how to adapt to this new normal. Jobs and stuff are going to be something different. There's no question things have to open up for the economy to open back up. But from a healthcare perspective, this isn't going anywhere, soon.
Yeah, and how different is it from when SARS had happened? I mean, I guess there's massive difference, but at the same time, when we look at just in general pandemic and people refer back to the one in 1819 and hey, let's look at St. Louis and compare it to what happened in, was it Pittsburgh or Philadelphia?
Hey, I don't even remember.
One of them had a big parade and the numbers went high, and then
Right.
St. Louis was one of the first that shut down their schools, they shut down their gyms. And so that's protocol, right? And
Yeah.
to me, we sort of got it down. We did our best. We still need to do more. As someone who works with companies globally, it's very interesting to hear the perspectives of what people in other countries have on the US.
Yeah. Well, and I understand that the countries that have done the best, whatever that means, did things as simple as implementing a requirement of masks. And that alone was enough to at least stem the spread so that people could, continue with life. And
right. Yeah. And those little things are the big things, right? But then when it comes to healthcare, being, since both of us are in this field, we always want to find ways that how do we work together? Because, the hip bone's connected to the, hip
yeah,
bone's
right, thigh bone, or
connected to.
Exactly.
That's why I saw it. I'm like, oh shoot, what is the hip bone connected to?
Right.
So yeah.
No, that's all right. Anatomy doesn't have to be part of what you do. That's all right.
I'm sales. So but the thing is, how do we work together?
Right.
If we're going to be doing things from a public health side, wear your masks, right? Which then if they're doing what they can to mitigate the pandemic, then what happens then on the hospital side? And then clinic side, and it cascades from there, in terms
and even globally, I think there's a difference too, because healthcare is delivered differently in different places. So for example, in most places in the world, healthcare is something accessible to everybody. And so when somebody's going in for treatment, they simply get it. Right. And it's a balance. This isn't a judgment on better or worse. But here in the US, one of the challenges we have is that people aren't going in for treatment because we have potentially, something like 40 million people who don't have health care. And many, many more who can't afford it, even if they do have it. I kind of fall into that category. So, how we're dealing, I think that it'll be interesting to see. There's been conversation about whether or not, the advent of COVID has opened up or kind of exposed certain aspects of our healthcare system that are worth considering how to refine or, rethink.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The acceleration of telemedicine is awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, that really is incredible. I love that. But we did the quick fix, in terms of like, okay, they basically lifted some of the restrictions in order to accelerate the use of it. But we're going to have to go back to actually having some of those restrictions. And those restrictions, for the most part, I believe in the high security that's wrapped around in HIPAA and GDPR. And so we have to get back to the point, when does that begin?
Well,
When does that
I would actually separate HIPAA and GDPR, because GDPR, I think, is for the greater good. HIPAA, I think, is for our insurance companies and healthcare system,
Yeah,
and is not really working to the benefit of patients
right,
and active users in the healthcare system, where GDPR is really about protecting personal information.
right. And though there is that distinction, to me, I just look at regulations and just kind of lump it in.
Yeah.
The regulations were lifted. I don't know in the EU, what exactly happened with GDPR, but in terms of HIPAA, regulations in general, especially in the US, they lifted that in order for doctors to be able to use Zoom or
Yeah.
FaceTime or things like that in order, therapists, counselors, doctors, you name it.
Well, and a lot of programs, and I'd be curious to see if, your experience in this, because you work with a lot of, you're in tech, basically, the tech
Yeah.
side of healthcare. So we're using a relatively new practice management software called Jane, which we love, and it's good for small practices, although they're expanding and getting bigger as well. And one of the things that they pushed through in like March, even though it was a late year rollout, was teleconferencing within the program.
Yeah. I
And
like it.
so HIPAA compliant, everything within regulations. And interestingly, um, it's not so difficult to get HIPAA compliant telehealth options.
Oh,
Even for you just have to know where to look, and people aren't necessarily making it available. At least in my
yeah.
experience, Zoom wasn't that.
Yeah. I hear
But
it's pricey.
yeah, but Ring Central, which is what I use, and you had a hard time getting on, which I think is one of the challenges that I have with Ring Central, is they use Zoom as their kind of platform,
Oh,
but it's
uh-huh.
HIPAA compliant for me
Uh-huh.
because I sign a BAA. It's policies and regulation. So HIPAA compliance is not something you achieve. HIPAA compliance is kind of something that you hope for, you do your best with,
Yeah. Do your
and you hope regulations won't, fall down on you.
Yeah. I don't know about that. I you know but
At least that's in my experience. I mean, I could be totally wrong, and I'm happy to be slammed for it.
well,
But
let's just say, as a smaller business entity, but a startup that is hoping to scale, they can't really dilly-dally with HIPAA compliance. And it's harder
right.
for them, to do B2B business, but for um, a clinic that directly works with the patient, that's a good position to be in. But from a startup standpoint, HIPAA compliance kind of a different ballgame in that regard. But
Well, because HIPAA compliance would be something that is being built into a platform,
yep, yep,
right?
exactly,
Right.
exactly.
But even then, because HIPAA, as I understand it, HIPAA compliance are a lot of rules that you are working towards achieving, but
Yeah.
it's check boxes. And if you check all the boxes and don't do so, for example, um, and I think it was Ring Central. So Ring Central is the platform I'm using. When the COVID thing started,
Yeah.
Ring Central met all of the HIPAA compliant checkboxes for us, all of them. Okay, they don't store the data for, or they store the data for, extended periods of time. Nothing's deleted afterwards. All the privacy controls are there.
Yeah.
But HIPAA requires that any vendors sign a BAA. I'm trying a business something agreement. And Ring Central said, well, we're only signing BAAs for companies that have 20 users or more.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what do private practice physicians or people do? And so we were using this platform without a BAA, which meant we really, in theory, were not HIPAA compliant.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I think basically your BAA is basically acknowledging to your vendor that you're taking that responsibility.
And which is fine. I'd have been happy to sign one. I was told we can't. So that changed in like mid-March, and they opened it up.
Right.
So,
right.
but that's not really reducing or getting rid of regulations. I think that was a business move on their end to keep customers.
So now what I'm also seeing, talking about regulations and politics, I did see in LinkedIn a politician in Washington, D.C. asking people to sign basically or create a letter and send it to representatives that they wanted it to be lessened from here on out. So instead of going back to HIPAA compliance, they were seeking support in terms of basically lessening these regulations.
Well, and that's an interesting thing. So it depends on what the goal, I think, of the regulations are. If the goal of the regulations are to truly protect our personal information, okay. Well, and I'm not a policy wonk, and I can't figure it out. But what I can tell you is the real life application of HIPAA is that a parent of an adult child will walk into a hospital and be told they can't talk to their family member because there isn't a HIPAA compliant, a form wasn't signed, or partners who may not have as clear a relationship. By law are kept from their loved ones,
right?
Because the form wasn't signed.
Yeah. And originally it was put into place. So for example, I have a friend, diabetic, and he worked at smaller businesses, and these businesses had a massively hard time trying to find insurance that would cover him. And so HIPAA basically was put into place for protecting some people in terms of when they switch jobs and they're trying to get insurance. That was one part. But there's always, there's always the pros and cons. Like a parent going in and they're not able to actually get information about their kid who's in the hospital.
I mean, and I see that I totally understand the pre-existing conditions thing. But I think that that's what it is. It's a pre-existing condition as opposed to protecting, I don't know that it would be interesting to me to see what HIPAA does for the protection of somebody's background as opposed to insurance regulations. Because that's, I think, and this is where the lines get fuzzy. So.
Right. If someone suffers from depression or they have anxiety,
mental health is a great example.
And that's a big one right there. And
so tell me, out of curiosity, let's shift away because I didn't mean to take us down this alley of HIPAA.
My only closing thought is as long as we embrace the fact that nothing really is perfect. There's always going to be obstacles. There's always going to be bumps, and it's going to be the "Hey, I told you so," or no, it does work or it doesn't work. The bottom line is it's there.
Right,
you
right.
know?
And you know what? I think that that's the story of healthcare in general, right?
Yeah,
Nothing is perfect, and we
yeah,
have to do the best with what we can and
right,
what we
right,
have.
right.
So as a segue, what's like coming up in blockchain? Like so one of the things that I love about the work that you do is I'm totally a blockchain fan. I guess I don't know enough about it, and I don't utilize it so well. But I think the average person associates blockchain, if they've even heard of it,
Yeah,
with cryptocurrency
yep,
and Bitcoin and things like
right,
that. But
right.
it has huge application in healthcare as well as finance and lots of other fields. So can you give like a quick explanation one of what it is, and then like what's coming down the pipeline?
Yeah. Well, I think some of the things that I'm most excited about is what it can do for clinical trials. And at my work, I work with Dr. Wendy Charles, and she is definitely a blockchain guru with massive amounts of clinical trial experience. And so, what I do at BurstIQ is I offer a test license, a free license for startups and innovators to actually use this frontier technology. I've had different startups tell me, I can't believe, that I can actually try this out, and because they were going to be charged 200,000 from another company or 80,000 from another company. And the other thing too is,
Just to have access to the technology?
yeah, yeah,
Wow.
absolutely. And that's just even trying for them to test drive it and figure it out if they even want to be using it, if it's going to be beneficial to the platform or their
Interesting.
application that they're making. So with what I do is I work with innovators all around the world, and the majority of them who jump on pretty quick and use our solutions, they already know quite a bit about blockchain. And the ones who come to us, sometimes interestingly enough, I've had a few come to me and say, well, my investor actually told me I needed to look into blockchain. And so here I am. And so I was like, wow, the VCs are pretty savvy about what's on the cutting edge. In fact, in some ways, more than some of the innovators. And so I find that interesting because if you've got someone who's investing a lot of money into a company and they obviously have done their research and they find that they can feel absolutely confident in that type of I don't want to say new wave, but with something that's different. And really VCs by nature, they're risk takers. Now, calculated risk.
Without a doubt. Yeah.
Yeah. So with blockchain, a lot of these companies that we work with, going back to clinical trials and blockchain, many of these companies need to validate the clinical aspect and the clinical benefits of what it is that they do, depending on what it is. So Wendy just did a presentation that was very thorough about, basically software as a medical device.
Okay.
Um, yeah. So, and then
In from a diagnostic perspective?
yeah, and there's
Okay.
different levels of risk. So if you think about a medical device, right, the different ones out there are some like a pacemaker that has software to run the pacemaker. But
Totally.
the person's life really depends on that pacemaker, right?
Absolutely.
Then there's what I would sort of refer loosely as external, where it's a website, you go in, it's kind of along the lines of patient reported outcomes. You go
Okay.
in, you log your pain level, you log how you're feeling, you log, you're basically tracking so then that your doctor can see a little bit more accurately of what it is that you're experiencing so they can evaluate, do they need to increase meds or back off of the
So,
med.
I'm diabetic as well. And I, for a period of time, I have type 2, not type 1. But for a period of time, I was wearing
Mhm.
a arm, I can't remember what they call it, but it's like a continuous checking device. And so I never had to do blood sticks. I would wave my phone over this device and it would give me readings. Um,
Oh, no way.
Talk about pretty cool. Now, interestingly, I stopped wearing it because it was fairly large,
Yeah.
expensive, and I
Uh,
found I'm active physically, so I was constantly knocking it off, and
oh, okay.
you can't put it back on once it's off.
Right,
It's
right.
done.
Someone needs to go back to development, make that thing a little bit more streamlined. So
Seriously.
yeah. So with blockchain for some of these, like for example, that company that you were using, that had the thing,
Yeah,
they would have had to gone through some type of clinical trial, right, in order to validate what it is that that device actually does, or software. So there's a lot of different categories, and then also there's different categories in terms of risk, right? So
totally.
like a pacemaker that goes inside of a body,
It's going to
right?
be way more. Yeah, absolutely.
So you have to have extensive research about the outcomes of
So,
that.
how is blockchain helping clinical trials?
Right. Good question. I think one of the most exciting things that it can do is more remote clinical trials. Most of the clinical trials, the people that are involved in it may live up to 300 miles away, and they're driving in, to meet with the clinic or the
Oh,
doctor that's there.
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then,
Which obviously then limits the number of subjects and
yes, absolutely. So imagine someone's doing a clinical trial on juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, right? And so doing a clinical trial using blockchain may actually allow them to expand the subject matter, because what's happening in clinical trials, because they may be limited on finding really good qualified patients to be a part of it. Some people unfortunately have kind of, I would say, fudge the numbers, but the person really isn't a quality, they're not really someone that
subject.
qualifies to be in the clinical trial. So
Right.
that to me is one of the most exciting things, that the clinical trials, if they are able to do some of these remotely, that there would be a lot more accuracy in terms of the evaluation of, what it is
Would
that
it
they're.
allow for uh, trial participants to be overseas? I mean, could that,
I
is
think,
assuming that all the other parameters are there?
yeah, I'm going to go with a yes, because, I mean, again, thinking globally, thinking about the pandemic and how that
Yeah.
really brought everybody together. Think about, I mean, there are so many different variations and aspects to it that I feel, considering how much we work remotely now and how much we work globally now, I don't see why that wouldn't be a possibility.
Right. And actually, I think that the hold up for that
Yeah.
is actually going to be regulatory and policies. I think that
Yeah.
the way I see U.S. healthcare is that um, we think very highly of ourselves. Nobody does it as good as we do, and therefore, any technology or ideas coming from elsewhere are always going to be suspect and questioned, when
Yeah.
in fact, we need to be more of a global partner on stuff like this.
Yeah. Yeah. The one last thing about the clinical trials is that that data that's collected, and in particular with our chain, being highly secure and acts like a big data engine, subjects can actually, there would be more ability to allow access to other researchers to data. So the what I call it, like, it's a paradox, right? That in order to utilize data to its fullest potential, you have to have it secure in order to set it free,
Right.
right?
Right. Yeah.
That's the paradox. And
Yeah.
so that was one of the absolute, critical focuses of BurstIQ, is to make sure that you can use the blockchain benefit, but that the data is highly secure.
Right.
But also with what we do, the flexibility of being able to use it. A lot of the things that IT and healthcare IT comes up against is, you got a solution, like look at, again, at the pandemic. You have to have something that's going to be quick to implement. And a lot of times in research and development, or if you're rolling out a new product, it's not a 4-week turnaround.
Well, actually, the pandemic is a perfect example of that. In the United States, we decided not to use the World Health Organization's testing kits. We
I
felt
remember
the need
on that.
to develop it on our own, and it took way longer than anybody thought, and caused as probably more damage than it helped, by the fact that we were not able to get great testing. And even today, now it's a little late, but I think that if you just wanted to go in to get tested, the number of tests that are out there that exist is silly. Like there's 150 different, especially for the antibody tests, which I think are, for whatever reason, less regulated, as opposed to the nasal swab where they shove the pick into your brain to get.
I feel a little leery. Like how do we know all of those are accurate?
We don't, and that's the thing. And actually, most of those tests say it's about a 50-50 chance. So you can take the test, but you're going to need to take the test again tomorrow. So it's interesting. I've always associated blockchain with how I understood it, from this idea of the distributed networks, and that that the security was built in as a component almost of the utilization of the technology, and I was drawn into it through my desire to see the creation of a universal health record. And I know that that's something that we've talked about.
Right.
But interestingly, in what I seem to be finding is that a lot of the people still working on developing this technology don't seem to be using blockchain.
Well, okay, so here's my experience. When I work with other companies and someone is kind of dilly-dallying, or we started some kind of conversation on LinkedIn, here's usually what I find. For those who are not using blockchain, the ones who are not using blockchain, it's, we've been talking about blockchain and we want to explore blockchain, but they haven't yet. And my advisement to different companies that are in that position, my position on that is, they're looking for solutions, right? And they're hearing these benefits of blockchain. Right. But the problem is everybody's doing their work. They're assigned to what it is that they're doing. There's no really additional time to be playing around with some APIs, right? Which is, the APIs is what the engineers go grab, right, for the lines of code. So what happens is they continue talking about it. They keep thinking about it, but they don't really designate anybody to go in and play with it. Now, on the flip side of that, let's say I've got an IT team. Well, I can't really afford to have like 2 of my professionals dilly-dallying and exploring with blockchain. We got to kind of work on these projects that we've got. So really, the other answer to that for people implementing it is an actual project. And then that's when basically, there's nothing like putting it into motion with some real goals because of a project. And that's
a project being the rollout of some sort of product.
Yep, exactly. So let's just use DaVita, a company, the company DaVita as an example. In COVID, I know, because I have friends that work
and they
there.
do dialysis, is that right?
Yep. Yeah, kidney dialysis. They have a lot of they have a lot of clinics.
Right. Around the country.
All over. Yeah. And so a friend of mine, she does UX on the front end, and they go into the clinics. Like every time, they have a conference somewhere, they'll go and they'll visit a handful of the clinics that they work with. And so, for example, having a project to work with, when I talk to teams like DaVita, they understand and they can see the big picture of the connectivity. They get it and they want to see it. But if you're working with tons of clinics, the best thing you can do is when you have an idea that you want to explore, you take one clinic and you pilot it with them. That's what would get them actually diving into blockchain.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then you get some other people, or I shouldn't say people, enterprises where I meet people who are part of the blockchain team. So some of your other enterprises,
Blockchain team for a specific product
well,
or company.
they actually invested the salaries to get people to explore it without needing the project. So to me, those are more of the avant-garde enterprise companies because
We're large, very large. Like I imagine Amazon is doing that because they
yeah,
have the resources.
yeah, but we imagine they're doing that, but really it's leadership who decides and says
Totally.
we're going to do it.
Right.
That's kind of what it really comes down to. You can have, everybody's got a budget of some
Right.
kind, and it depends on how leadership is looking forward and making decisions for their company to take action on it now.
Right. Well, and that's a really interesting point. So, you talk about tech leadership. I have a little bit more knowledge about Amazon simply because I live in Amazonville,
Right.
and my son, is part of the AWS team. But and I see what I've understood about Bezos is that he is somebody, who would potentially, take that kind of calculated risk because he sees the long-term benefit. But on the flip side, I was just listening to an interview, one of Joe Rogan, his interviews with Elon Musk. Okay?
Yeah.
And Elon Musk, as I understand, is like, and it wasn't from this interview, but is not a fan of blockchain.
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
Uh-huh.
And that may have changed, but it's interesting that you say that if it's the driving force of these big companies' leadership,
Yeah.
So.
And then hence the innovation center inside of a hospital or inside
Right.
of a company, and they have great intentions, but again, it just always goes back to the team. I just see, my interaction with different mid-size and enterprise level companies, it really comes down to the people and the culture that they have. Because man, some meetings compared to others, there's a vast difference.
Absolutely.
It totally comes down to the people,
but that's it, and that is about leadership. I think that there's I use this all the time, this idea that A people hire A people, B people hire C people.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you have a leader who is in any way hesitant or not super confident in themselves, they will often surround themselves with people who they see as not a threat necessarily, as opposed to
leadership.
Yeah. And as opposed to leaders who were like, look, I want to surround myself with the absolute best because this is where we want to go.
Yeah. Right.
So yeah, it is. It's a leadership style.
A humble leader.
What's that?
The humble leader. The humble leader who's not who wants to grow and who wants to learn. The leader who understands they don't know everything.
Right. And it's interesting because even with healthcare relation to blockchain, I'm reminded as we talk that the way I come at it and how I look at blockchain's potential impact on healthcare is actually less in the developmental and business side, even though that part is critical for the implementation of these products. But in my mind, blockchain is a technology that can level the playing field globally. And so even just talking about the clinical trials that you were mentioning, the fact that because the technology is secure, because the technology can be fast, because you have so many different necessary, moving parts, there are ways to make it so that you have the same parameters in Central Africa as you do for Illinois.
Yeah.
And then, you've now expanded the reach and the ability of subjects for these trials.
Very efficiently, which is great. My theory is always time is money, right?
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing. And so, the other thing that I was thinking about in terms of innovation and seeing technology evolve, I always love using the photography example. Kodak, the day of film, and Kodak publicly announced that digital photography was no threat to the future of film.
Right.
And so I call that innovator die. And it's the ultimate. And if you look throughout the history, those examples are just over and over and over again. Yet here we are as humans, our ability to evaluate, embrace, look forward, lead a team, implement things. All of those things have to come together to innovate for healthcare. And when we talk about, innovate is it is a buzzword, right?
It is, but it's for good reason.
Yeah, it makes sense, which is why, we grab onto it. And really what we're talking about is it evolving the technical aspect in order to reach more people with higher quality. And so that ultimately is the essence of health tech.
Right. For me, the biggest piece of it is finding a way to separate it from having it be all about making money, because that, to me, that's the innovation killer. People create this incredible technology that is not accessible or unavailable to the overwhelming majority of people because it's so expensive.
Right. Well, you get your social entrepreneurs in there. We have the United Nations Global Compact that's really, leading a lot of they've defined a lot of the values, let's put it that way. And, it ends up being a nice rubric that people can go to in terms for leadership to see as an example. So we see it all, I see a lot of enterprise companies that really truly want to embrace things like the SDGs, which is, the United Nations Global Compact. Then you see the smaller ones that come out of the woodwork because, and have a lot of drive because they do care and they do want more health for all. So I think, but the reality is that business can't run unless they have revenue. So
sure.
What you're talking about is that drive of doing it for money versus doing it for the greater good. Where is that blend together?
Correct. Right? And that actually has to be achieved. I think that's one of the arguments. I heard can't remember who was talking, but it was a U.S. senator about the fact that, healthcare in the U.S. is so much better because of innovation and business, and globally it's not as good because it's less about money. When in reality, that isn't an accurate statement. And some of the most incredible medical technology comes out of a teeny little country that nobody likes to talk about in the Middle East, where tech is like the new, blue collar work, right? In Israel. The number of startups that exist, tech startups in Israel, is huge and enormous. And that's a country with socialized medicine. So how are they able to figure it out? Now, granted, everybody's there to make money. There's no question. In fact, a lot of my family work in high tech in Israel in various different things. And you can bet that their companies are trying to do as well as they can, but they do it on a global market. So, I do think that that's where maybe, like you were saying, the social entrepreneurs then need to come in and kind of carve a way to make available to everybody the things that are hugely beneficial that could change our lives from a healthcare perspective, and find the money piece as a separate function, whether it's so blockchains, hugely relevant for fintech, for financial technology, right?
Yeah.
And that's always going to be about making money, and real estate ownership, and transfer of ownership is also, again,
Mm-hmm.
about making money. The challenge with healthcare is that when healthcare is put into that making money piece versus the greater good,
Yeah.
you create these technologies that very few people can afford, or they're so expensive they're hesitant to use it, and that's our healthcare system is built on that.
Right. Well, it's heart and soul.
Yeah.
And I think that when we look around at different companies, the ones that claim to do great things for the world, we can see the veneer that it's a PR move, right? And people, they put their dollars where they want to support. And
Right.
so I think that it kind of balances itself out in terms of Israel. I'm pretty familiar with the top tech cities in the world for healthcare, and Tel Aviv is definitely one of the top 20.
Yeah.
So you said that, I was like, oh, yeah, you spot on. Yeah,
Oh yeah. And the funny thing is, there's a I don't know if you've ever read this book, but there's a great book called Startup Nation.
oh, I've heard
um,
of.
it's a short read. It's a really easy read, but it talks about why Israel is a leader in high tech globally. And
Okay.
interestingly, when it comes down to it, it has to do with a willingness to fail and take risk.
Yeah.
When you grow up in Israeli society, um, daily life is risky, and you live with war as kind of a reality around you.
Yeah.
Um, Everybody serves in some way or another. And so you learn at a very young age to take risks,
Yeah.
calculated risks, but risks nonetheless.
Yeah.
And innovation is reliant on failure.
Yes. Right.
If you don't fail, you're not figuring it out. And if you say, "Oh, I've never failed," well, then I'm going to question whatever it is that you're doing, because nobody gets it right the first time.
Right. Absolutely. That definitely was like the peak of this entire talk for me, because it's, even when I look at startups, I'll look at the team's background, in particular the CEO, and I want to see that they've had other businesses, because it tells me a lot in terms of their aptitude for entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
That is largely taking risks,
Yeah, totally.
just what we're talking about.
Totally. And it is tough. I think in healthcare, people want to not think about risk, but without risk, you can't have the refinement of an end product. And frankly, that's what clinical trials are all about,
Yep,
right? Clinical
exactly.
trials often have great risk, but it comes at the benefit of long-term greater good.
Yeah.
And participants understand that.
Yeah.
Um,
And there's a whole art to a clinical trial too. That is not something that people can just pick up and do. You really need an expert kind of overseeing it and guiding you so that it's done well, but done right. It will definitely refine a company,
yeah.
I think, in their product and their services. And that to me that's why that's one of the most exciting parts of healthcare blockchain.
Well, it'll be interesting to see kind of what's coming down the pike, in terms of, especially from the software perspective. For me, I'm still really looking for as a patient advocate and as somebody who is, constantly working on promoting or helping individuals have better control and understanding of over our own health.
Yeah.
The technology exists. All the tools are there. The only
Right.
reason it doesn't exist right now in terms of the ability for interoperability and connection from things is money.
Yeah.
It's money and politics and business. Great example. I had a client not too long ago who they have a rare disease. Okay,
Okay.
so they have a insurance plan. It's Kaiser, so it's one of the big ones in the country, at least on the West Coast. But the specialist of this disease is not in Kaiser, so they have their Kaiser person, but they
Right.
have to go see this other person in another system. So those two systems don't talk to each other.
Right.
Okay? And so information isn't necessarily passed along smoothly.
Right.
And then they had to have procedures done at yet another facility. And they fall through the cracks.
Yeah.
And when I step in to help, all I'm doing is facilitating communication. That's it.
Yeah. Right.
And because the technology exists to be able to do this today, for me, that's one of the most frustrating things at kind of watching from the sidelines and waiting for this to come down, because
Yeah.
it's all possible. And in fact, most of the organizations do it in their own microcosm, right? So if all your needs are within Primera or within Aetna's network or within Kaiser, you're okay because their system talks to each other.
Right.
But that's not how life works.
Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, compared to, again, I'm trying to scan my brain on a good analogy of what was then and what is now. And I'm hopeful that we'll get there. To me, for some reason, the image that came to my head is, imagine you're tiling a tabletop, you lay down all the tiles, right? And then you take the grout, or is that what it's called?
Yeah,
You take the grout, you smash it in between.
Spread it across, yeah.
Yeah, and it just connects everything up. That to me is kind of what blockchain is.
Interesting. That's cool. That's an interesting analogy.
It just kind of
Did you just make that up?
There. Well, yeah, as you're talking about it, and you're talking about basically the disjointed aspects and what this could mean for this person's health and the care that they're getting,
Right.
because of big gaps of information that are not being shared.
Correct.
The disconnected part of it. And so while you were saying that, for some reason, that's the image that came to my head. You think of those big, harsh gaps in between the tile, and it just feels, it's just not connected. But then if we can just connect all of it, and I feel pretty confident that we'll get there.
That's
no
awesome.
way we can't.
Say that again?
There's no way we can't get there.
Well, so interestingly, if I don't disagree, we're going to get there, but the question is whether it's going to be us or someone outside of the US. Because I think one of the challenges we have here within the US is our system works against us, right?
Yeah.
The system does not want to see interoperability because every individual wants to be the big player. And everybody wants to have their platform be the one that's used.
Right.
Which is why
I hear what you're saying.
Until there is someone who's been able to break through that, what would I think make a difference would be going back to your comment and idea of leadership.
Yeah.
True leadership in my mind would be a US president of some sort. They don't exist in my world at the moment, but who would say, like Kenny, imagine somebody saying, we have the technology, we have the ability to create this interoperability between all the healthcare networks, and we're going to make it a priority to put that in place in the next 10 years.
Yeah, it's like, imagine when HIPAA was implemented. It's going to be policy that's going to say, or potentially it could be policy that says, we must connect up the data. That's
But
all those,
HIPAA came in and actually hindered, I think, as opposed to helped healthcare.
right?
Um,
Well, people will probably feel the same about connecting up data.
that's true, but therein lies blockchain,
Yep.
because the reason people feel concerned, I think, about
Protective of
uh,
it.
data is concern for security.
Yeah, and also it's their data. They've worked really hard to collect all that
Absolutely,
data.
absolutely.
You know, if we kind of go into that thought of data is more expensive than, or no, higher value than oil, right?
Yeah. Did
Everyone,
did you explore Andrew Yang at all when he was running for president? So he's a an entrepreneur, and from the business world, and he had some pretty way out there ideas. But I
okay,
loved listening to him. And one of
yeah,
the things that he talked about is this idea of leveling that playing field, and in something like healthcare, when we have all the companies fighting each other to be the number one,
yeah,
we're actually hurting ourselves individually in the long run. And so, better to make, especially data. He was a big proponent of the fact that Amazon and Google and Microsoft should be paying us for our data,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
because that
Um,
is their gold, is
yep.
our data. And as patients in healthcare, that is what will save everyone when that data is available to be able to be shared as appropriate and as needed. So
Mm-hmm.
anyway, Angie, this is always great. I had all these other questions, totally unrelated, but I'm not gonna bother. I want to keep it to under an hour. Um,
Well,
so, but
we can wrap it up, but you can ask me a couple other questions offline.
all right, yeah, totally. Um, thank you for joining me
Oh yeah.
today. This was great, and then I will